well. I'll see how many people. Hey, it's going to be a lonely stream, I know. It shall. Let's see, are we live? It's going to be very lonely. I was hoping more people would show up. Considering I have put this off for nearly a week. But I did not feel well Tuesday. Though I have teased this. And as a subject matter, a lot of people are not willing to go over, or they don't want to go over. People have touched on part of this interview, and I found something far worse. But understanding why stuff is the way it is. So, I was hoping to have people to help out, maybe cease the suffering. I've touched on some of this before, but it is rather interesting. Now, pause it, I have to. I cut down this interview, and there's another part. Because she worked on Assassin's Creed Syndicate and Assassin's Creed Valhalla. This is where this is from. So, and I meant to do this last week. And I was actually going to break this up and timestamp it, basically. So, I mean, I cut out the intro and the outro. The more I find on this woman, particularly, it's very interesting. The older stuff is more revealing, to be honest. Because I found another interview. Not interview, but it was a speech with Womanize Conference, which I cut down. I have that cut down. Where she talked about something different or very similar concept. Because it talks about her growing up, specifically. And what inspired her. Because what caused me to look more into this is her activism. How do you get an activist to believe and say what they believe? And this is pretty much what she is. Now, when I found the Assassin's Creed Sisterhood, it was at like 800 views. No one's really viewed this. They've only viewed parts of this. Last I looked at this was 1,066 views in almost 4 years. Initially, it's about an hour. I have it cut down, but I feel it needs to be gone over because of the subject matter. See, the warning signs have been on the wall about Sweet Baby Inc. It's like, yeah, this is going to be a 3 or 4 hour stream. I'd rather knock it out in one go, so to speak. I'm sure it's going to get more views in post. So, a lot of this interview goes into how she works on Assassin's Creed and the other. The Womanize clip is her giving an essay, and that gives a little more preference. Because there's other stuff that's referenced that became later projects. So, we have to begin because this is like literally an hour and 30, and I'm like, some people who, and this is a different take on this, and I'd rather have her speak in her own words. Because there is some language, and it's very common in what she uses. So.
We could be asking about.
Pardon my cut out the beginning. Because I actually had to edit this down. So the first part is sensitivity reading. Sweet Baby Inc. initially was brought in for narrative work. And the first part is about 8-10 minutes on sensitivity reading. First, you will notice this woman has a lot. She speaks a lot. And you will catch the language used. There's some tells. There's words used. Now, granted, a lot of this stuff she says reads double meaning. So, bear in mind they had just introduced her and she describes her own self. And parts of this interview are word salad, to be honest. So.
But what I want to start with is sensitivity rating, because this was a new term for me personally.
Most people do not know what sensitivity reading is. Bear in mind, this is a company that's worked with WotC and other companies. Sensitivity reading can be summed up as modernizing words. Something similar is like, if I ever went into it, is the changes to D&D. You can't say savages, you can't say slavery, you can't say this. You got to bear in mind, this is what sensitivity reading is. Sorry to cut to the meat of the bones this quickly. This is very long. But let's hear her describe it in her own words.
And I'm pretty curious about how it all works. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, for sure. So with my company, Sweet Baby Inc., we're a narrative development company. And for me, what that means is everything from, writing and narrative design to world building, to character development, to scripts, to punch-ups. And for me, what's one of the most important things that I think I try to bring to any work that I do is representation. Is that feeling of, is this authentic? Is the diversity that we have in this game authentic? Does it come from an honest place? Does it come from a real place? And for me, what sensitivity, the work that we do in sensitivity is often tied into the work that we do in narrative, because I don't think they're necessarily two different things. When you're reading through a story, I'm thinking, okay, one, does the narrative work? And two, how does the narrative represent the players, not the players, but the characters in it? How does it represent the world that it's creating? How are people going to take that world, and how are people going to find themselves in it? So sensitivity reading is looking for blind spots in the work. It's looking for things that could, rub people the wrong way, things that could be insensitive to a certain culture or a certain kind of person or a certain identity, and trying to not only mitigate that, but to craft the story in such a way that, we're not oppressing anybody, we're not being unkind to anyone, and we're representing folks in a positive, supportive, or engaging light.
Are you able to influence?
So that first part is a mission statement. The follow-up question here, because it's a lot, she says more in these things than you give credit. People they've taken snippets from it here and there. First and foremost, since she lumps in the sensitivity reading with her representation, she is an activist first and foremost. She uses activist language. If you are familiar with activist language, you're going to pick it up from her. What a lot of people don't understand in gaming is representation for who? Who would be offended? Because at this time, it's hinted that they had Miles Morales in the process. Another interview, roughly around this time, or I should say the speech that she gave at a conference, was her working on Validate. And the troubles with it. It came out that the Validate developer only wanted to work with black people. And she had issues with that. That's in a different one. It's not in this particular. But a lot of it is if you're in gaming. This is pretty much was their mission statement. They worked in narrative writing as well as sensitivity reading. Now you're about to see a follow-up. There's something to think about. She's about to ask a question. Can you influence a plot or narrative in development? Now, this has been, might be brought up here soon, because this is what has gotten Sweet Baby Inc. in trouble, particularly. Because the narrative is, I'm not sure if she says it, which part in this she says it. The idea is you can influence a narrative outright, or you can form it from a ground up. Or maybe because you're not subverting it or changing it. Because she looks at everything from a lens of representation. This is a theme with her. Not the first. I've seen some stuff on it. More recent years, she's mask off. But this was in 2020.
How many or in what manner women and minorities are included at the planning stage of a game? Or can you only give feedback on existing characters already in the script?
So for me, that's why I tend to focus, my form of sensitivity reading or risk assessment and the work that we do on building the narrative. Because I think there are two kinds for me, kinds of sensitivity work. And one of them is that, you are presented with something that's more or less finished, that's already in there. And kind of your job there is to tell someone, okay, this might be offensive. This character feels, inauthentic to the identity that they're supposed to convey. Or this, this plot point is a trope that's, have negative associations with.
Remember this. This is the same woman who put forth a narrative and signed off in Assassin's Creed. Valhalla is female. Ivor is canon. She also later on signed off on a black Agrabota who's supposed to be a Jotun, a giant, a mother of monsters with Loki. Okay? She's also going to get into a part about historical. This is what people like when I heard Dane and them talk about this. They don't get it. That's why this is interesting. It should not be, and just to preference this gets interesting. I'm going to have to break up the monotony or else people go insane. A lot of this is, she's not an actress. She believes in this cause. But this is her design philosophy. But I'm going to stand by it that I'll have to point this out. Because it's going to get interesting. As I say, and it's going to be wrong stuff. Because she says to fit a narrative. But she said female Ivor is canon. Same with Agrabota.
A given kind of identity. And that's one kind of work that I used to do a lot more, and I try to do less of it now. Or when I do that kind of thing now, I prefer to, try to spread that work among a team of experts, a team of consultants from different backgrounds who can address, my own blind spots and kind of create a panel on that. Because that's an area where, there's not a lot of creative input that they're necessarily going to allow us to give, because they're so far along. So a lot of the time, that kind of sensitivity work results in, cuts of certain things or slight changes. But what I prefer to do, and I don't really call it sensitivity reading, but I think of it as just, bringing representation to something, is trying to build a narrative and a story that include moments and elements custom made to bring representation and joy to people, because that's kind of where Sweet Baby lands on it. It's that I did a talk at GDC called Representation as Innovation, and for me, the idea that we can create something new, create something exciting, create something fun if we go in and from the ground up build something that includes everybody. It's a lot stronger.
That's really interesting.
Right there. They have more control. Now, traditionally, it's true. If these people are brought in as a consulting service, it is radically different than someone who's handed a script to a narrator. It's very, very different. This is the side that isn't getting played a bunch. It's not like saying, well, they're monsters. No, because this is very different. A lot of this stuff is being played off as Gamersgate 2.0. And I don't buy that narrative, because it isn't. This is a consulting firm for 4 years who's worked with companies. That same GDC conference, she basically said, I think this was the one of the GDC conferences she got quoted from, was like, if the corporate suits don't see the problem with the PR, have a conference with your marketing team. Maybe. Basically, it's the argument to akin to take them out for coffee. Show them the outrage machine that was Twitter. Basically, it's akin to saying a thug walking into a business demanding tax protection fees. Pay me. This is a nice business you got here. Be a shame if someone burnt it down. This isn't the first time we've heard stuff like this. Anita Sarkeesian did this. Other people did this. Bear in mind, this is 4 years old. Almost. You would think she said this the other day. A lot of these activists are like, sure, because you see this in that. May have to do a talk on Helldivers, because I do have interesting thoughts on Helldivers. But literally, she is saying the representation is all important and in the narrative. Now, I will say this for the record. When you have more influence on the narrative, if you build it from the ground up, that is the case as what happened with Suicide Squad. They had a lot of creative control. She worked on, but as I said, this is when she was talking about her work on Valhalla and Syndicate. To give you an idea. I warn people, this is going to be long form if you're going to listen to it, because your head will explode. Because a lot of this is, you would think this is pretty much activism. So,
I'm kind of curious about, I don't know if you've run into this with Assassin's Creed in particular, but you talked about, tropes and, maybe because this could be a stereotype, or, that this could be harmful to people because there are already certain attitudes maybe associated with it. And these are historical games. So those tropes they are based in history. Is that something that you've run into, or?
I think for something like this, what you have to remember is that the history that we're aware of is heavily biased by the culture in which we live and have lived since then. So when we create stories about colonization, we're generally going to hear from the colonizers. When we tell stories about, oppression, we often sugarcoat it because a lot of those oppressors are still, systemically and structurally with us today. So we are still influenced. And so a lot of the time, I think the problem that we run into in anything historical, any kind of story like that, whether it's a game, whether it's a movie, a TV show, whatever it is this feeling that everything we know about the oppression, about the structural, the structure of their society, the stuff that we think is, a given, feels natural to us, but anything that feels unlikely or any, anomalous things end up getting kind of brushed aside. So when we look at the Victorian era, for example, we look at that and we go, oh, well, that was probably, everybody was white, is what we see in media a lot of the time, right? We look at these things and it ends up becoming super white without actually inviting the fact that there was actual diversity there. There are many instances of people in all levels of society from a ton of different backgrounds. But when we look at it through our lens now, and we start casting something, people go, no, that can't possibly be. You're just forcing diversity on it. You're just tokenizing people. But ultimately that's actually more accurate, but it doesn't look accurate to us. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's more limiting also in what kind of stories you can tell. If people are always expecting those same things.
Exactly. There's an expectation that we have. And
I did
for
not
me,
realize I was muted.
there's this thing called the Tiffany problem. And it's how I like to talk. It's one of the ways I like to talk about, historical diversity, in that the Tiffany problem is that Tiffany was actually.
Wow, the moment you realize the boomer moment, you feel like you're not speaking. Okay, so pardon that was the phrase. All right, so I'll repeat what I just said. The issue right now, her main harping point on the history is written by the victors. The Allies won World War II and saw the atrocities of Nazi Germany. So what was the response? Say them, make sure it never happens again. Eradicate the philosophy. Praising of the Nazi regime is not very well sought after the war. Because if the Nazis won the war, it would have been reversed. So she uses the word colonizers. And that is not the 1619 project. That is a very interesting idea. Like, I'm sure if you asked her, she's a fan of the myth of the noble savage. Basically, the colonizers and the Europeans pretty much influenced the history. For the few I've seen, this is a philosophy with her. She came from this and she was taught this. Vincent had the philosophy for this, but it comes from something, I say, different. It is a philosophy that they view. It's very weird when you're judging history. Assassin's Creeds are loosely based upon that history period. It uses a historical setting to tell the story. So saying it's historical, you can't say it's a one-for-one. It's not a Shogun, which is loosely a one-for-one except for maybe history changes, maybe name changes. But the events depicted are real. Assassin's Creed is a fictional setting that uses historical eras to tell the tale. To tell the story or tell the tale. You're not going to insert. No one is saying that there is no minority representation in Victoria, England. See, Hogwarts Legacy had this. Because you'll see her bring up a book. Supposedly she wrote it, and I'm pardon my not looking into it, of just reading time, and I have to read the book because I don't want to misrepresent it. Victorians, black people during the Victorian age. Because bear in mind, when they did Anne Boleyn and Queen Charlotte, they used black people. They said, oh, Queen Charlotte could be black. Queen Charlotte had children. You would know if you had anyone of African or black descent in the family. The British royal family was white as snow. And that's probably not a representation of all of Victoria or the Gilded Age. So, it's very troubling as a person who likes history. These people, the concept of representation can be dramatic. She wants to use the word. From everything I've seen, she will not use the term modern era or basically judge history. You cannot judge history by the modern era. And that's what she does, unfortunately.
A fairly common name hundreds and hundreds of years ago.
Oh, and this is the Tiffany thing. This part's really, really good. So the name Tiffany, which goes back to ancient Greece. So the Greeks had a term for it. But she very much misrepresents it.
But if you write about that, if you actually say, hey, I'm going to put a character named Tiffany in my game set, years, centuries ago, people go, oh, that's such a modern name. That doesn't sound right. So the reality of the situation, which is, yes, Tiffany was a name back then, feels wrong and ahistorical if we look at it today. And I think it's the same way when we put diversity into the past. People go, oh no, but you're just putting diversity in. They don't even feel ready because they've been exposed to so much, whether it's whitewashed, whether it's just, colonized media, that they go, oh, there can't possibly have been diversity back then, because my understanding of it was that this was a homogenous time. And so I think I look at it like that.
Or they make excuses for it, like, yeah, well, sure, okay, maybe there were some women in World War I that were on the front lines, but it was only in these specific situations, so we shouldn't show it in the game.
Exactly.
Now, bear in mind, this interview was done about the time you had Battlefield, 5, I believe. That was massively with the women sniping on the front line. There were female frontline combatants in World War I and World War II. Hell, there's animes about it. It's not about the misrepresentation of it. The thing about the Tiffany problem, right? Tiffany as it stands, Tiffany, is how we say it now. It's been the spelling of it since probably about the 1700s. Because I looked into the namology origin of it. Tiffania was the one prior. Now it's about language changes. You could always look at a name, find its origins. As I said, the name Tiffany goes back to the ancient Greeks. Just as James, John, all this. Now, the way they describe it as it's problematic. Now, you flash forward to a lot of other games they either inspired or worked with. Now, I think it's Black Girls Gamers is the one who did Forspoken, not Sweet Baby Inc. I mean, that's clearly a fantasy tale written by Square Enix. But as I said, the idea is, and you can make the case, right? It's just hypothetical. They're making a setting and they want to set it in a period in the world. And the thing is, that other woman that's there, she is at Ubisoft still. That voice, I know it, because I know it from the state of the games. She's still there. Or she's at least in Ubisoft. Ubisoft doesn't get rid of people. The thing is, she's like, yeah, stick it there to these people. It's a strange thing. Like, I will say this. No one would have an issue if you put a spin on it. I mean, show people the true story of Amistad. Okay? I mean, you can go back in time and set a story correct, like Shogun's doing it. Masters of the Air did it. I want to do a review of Masters of the Air. They even brought in Tuskegee Airmen. German officer asked him, like, why do you fight for a nation that doesn't respect you? They have their reasons. It handles it perfectly. Tuskegee Airmen, yeah, they weren't promoted. It had one of the first black, and I didn't know this, graduates. He's the son of a black general. Okay? From West Point. Probably in the era. Because I guess they didn't want black people or African Americans could not cut the course. And West Point was generally a guaranteed officership. No, you don't highlight that. But they look at this. So it's a very interesting take. There's also, you could extend this to Hollywood. Hollywood is getting tired of doing historical pieces. I remember a news story. They don't want to do it because you're either going to have to cover too many taboo subjects. I mean, Harry Potter, or like the Hogwarts Legacy game, right? What's supposedly set in late 1800 London. It's the most diverse place ever.
You have so much of that happening. And for me, there's so many leaps that we already take with history. There are so many things that we decide are true. And so many of the protagonists that we choose for our games are exceptional by their nature. So why not, why not take that further? Why not say that, yeah, we can tell different kinds of stories? And frankly, we see so many of these eras in history through one lens, and then we forget that these same stories, the same society was experienced by so many different kinds of people. And I would bet a lot of the time that those stories are more interesting. The stories that take place from a perspective that's going to show us things we don't know. I have a book called The Black Victorians, and it's such an interesting read because it's something I had never really seen a lot of the time. I had kind of, we all kind of think, okay, well, that was slavery then, and so that must have been how everybody saw things, but there were incredible things being done all around the world, and we rarely explore that in media because it doesn't fit what we're used to. So I think there's just so many opportunities to kind of change that and to show people both exceptional and unexceptional from different backgrounds.
That sounds like a really interesting book. I have to look into that.
Sure, I recommend it.
Just to add to that a little bit, I was really surprised when I saw the movie Victoria and Abdul about Queen Victoria and Indian Muslim servants. And yeah, like so many people didn't know about it, specifically because the people around her were very careful to erase all evidence of it historically.
This is the part that makes my brain hurt. So, this part, they try to sneak past as you miss the language. So, thing is, right? Fortunately, thank you. She basically says a book. No one is saying that the Gilded Age or any of these people that they were erased either. Now, it exists. The hardest part about this book is, it's a subject matter. Saying that there wasn't. Of course, Queen Victoria would have basically foreign servants. No one kept that hidden. It was a queen. He was an Indian prince who later went back to India. India at the time was still a British colony or part of England in some form or fashion. Of course, they would have a relationship. That's why when you're about to see this is weird. Good movie, by the way. But misrepresented it here. Like, course they would.
Because they were just so upset by it.
Which I think is that's so interesting to me, because it's a deliberate attempt to erase things. It's and yet we look back on it and we go like, oh, we take it at face value. We just assume because we don't know about it, it didn't happen. And we don't think about the fact that it's not just that we forgot, but people actively worked against preserving this information.
Absolutely. So that's why I do like Assassin's Creed so much, because I feel like there's so much room to tell stories that, there's probably a lot of people in history we didn't know about who did significant things, who are just kind of marginalized and erased. And I feel like that's always my frustration when I come across people who are like, well, that's not historically accurate. And I just want to ask them, but how do you know?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, when I see people writing historical fiction and trying to diversify it, a lot of the time there's this pressure they feel, I think, to justify everyone who is for example, not white. They have to go like, oh, well, here's the story of how I came to be here, because you accept all the white people, but you don't accept these kinds of people. And for me, I like to see pieces of media where it's not explained, because that's not necessary. If you see someone who's different in that timeline, then it's probably because it happened, because this existed, and we don't need to necessarily know every detail of that story, of how we don't have to justify every time we want to step outside of the norms. We can just have it happen and realize that that's almost more representative in a lot of ways.
Yeah, like I was really happy with Ned's representation in Syndicate.
Absolutely.
He was just there, and nobody questioned it, or nobody like asked, well, how did you get here? And that whole story. I feel
This is the thing about Ned. Ned is considered transgender, considering it's a woman who basically dressed as a man to work with the assassins in the Gilded Age. Okay? When this was set. Now, you do the math, you can figure it out, do your own research. It wasn't a controversy. It's not a big deal. I mean, you can get into the whole Assassin's Creed. Like, why can't there be a gay assassin? Because there would not be any assassin bloodline. These people, sometimes I question. So, that's the character there she is referenced. Which, yeah, because in game, no one really cares about that. And then you assume that she's non-binary or trans. And even by the wikis, it has that for Ned.
feel like that's still. I hope that things have gotten a little better about trans representation in games since then, but at the time, at least, there were still a lot of, like, even in RPGs where they were, ostensibly they were accepted as part of your crew, but there was always that option to ask them about it, and it
Yeah.
always felt a little wrong.
Agreed. I think there's something really, for me, it's just, there's something really beautiful about being able to just kind of understand that that's a character's story, that you aren't necessarily entitled to it because your experience of that character is going to be what they want to tell you. I think we often give protagonists this really invasive way of connecting with people.
Yeah.
But I think there's something nice about going like, I'm here. This is my identity. This is who I am. This is how I live. And that's the part that's going to be interesting.
I wanted to ask, do you often face pushback about your suggestions when you do these sensitivity readings? And have you ever felt like your advice was ignored?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's part and parcel of the process, is that a lot of the time when a project that I'm on is purely a sensitivity reading, it's often done so that they can feel like they've done their due diligence. But a lot of the time, especially when it's late, the problem ends up being like, hey, we can't change these things that you suggest. We might agree with them. The team or the client might go like, hey, this is really cool. We like this idea. Unfortunately, we've already recorded all of these scenes.
So is it at that point, do you feel like it's just a formality that they're asking you to look over the text even though they know they can't change it?
I think a lot of it is to create answers. And this is being a little inside baseball. It's a little, I don't want to dismiss the practice, but I think that a lot of the time it's more for what are people going to be angry about when this comes out. It's more about like making sure that the PR is good. It's so that when someone says, hey, we find something offensive about this, they have an answer for it. And I do respect that. Like I think that it's important to think about how your product is coming out into the world and being ready to answer and discuss the important issues. that people bring up, but isn't it better when you do that work as part of the development process? I think for me, the reason that I don't do a lot of pure sensitivity readings anymore, and I kind of more flag things and try to.
Again, I had myself muted. I need to mute this microphone and do a skim. So she complains about the sensitivity reading as far as this is still on here. This is in the second part about representation. Those brilliant thoughts. I should just record them. Like, now it doesn't come out because it was muted. Boomer moments. So, I forgot. Saving it. Let's move along.
Make them different within the narrative is that I want to make sure that the representation that we bring to the stories is organic and holistic and part of the creation of it. So like one of the ways that I talk about it a lot is this, like, if you call someone in to tell you what you've done wrong in your already completed project, the best outcome.
Oh, I forgot. She says she gets pushback for her narrative when it's already out. Okay. So if she is brought on to and they say, oh, that's a good idea, then you they're like, well, but they realize they can't change if a project is that far along in the consulting. Good idea, but you really can't change a character if it's already there. If the character is already done. Now, in reality, does it fix it? Probably not. So, I'm going to get through this, but this is awful. So, the idea, as I said when I had myself muted, is the PR team, right, has to. They go, oh, you have to get the press out if any bad press. Why would a game have bad press? A game is made or broken not because of the narrative as much as the gameplay. If your game's a buggy mess, why do you care? I mean, if a game is a narrative-driven game, that's very different than a game that the narrative is just a narrative. If it's just a base story that the world is built around, seasonal story, I only have to care about it for a mission or two or a season. You have to give me a reason to care. Unless it's a narrative-driven story with a setting. Elden Ring, Dragon's Dogma. I mean, they at least try to world build. You know. But most games' narrative is utterly drivel. So why does representation matter? I mean, not to say it doesn't. You can... And she probably was saying, does she receive pushback? Of course she does. Because it doesn't make sense. She's probably been told more than once that her stuff is wrong. It probably explains their later projects, too.
That you can get is to kind of sand down the rough edges of your story. Is to say, okay, there are these rough bits and those little places that are going to hurt people. We're going to sand those down and make sure that they're not there. But what that ends up with isn't necessarily something representative. It's just something that's inoffensive. It's something that...
She's conflating sensitivity reading with representation. Sand down corners means you change the language itself. So I may have to break down into what's been happening with D&D. What they want to do with it is a separate setting. I mean, you change the nature of the drow. You change if you take out the slavery and other aspects. It's part of the narrative for the drow. And that's what she would do. You can't say savage. You can't say barbarian. You can't do that. It's different. Because modern sensibility says because you can't say a word. But this is her own voice, her own words.
It doesn't outwardly offend a group of people or doesn't say anything about a certain kind of person, but instead it doesn't say anything at all. So the thing that I prefer to kind of shape it as, and what we do at Sweet Baby, is it's more about saying, here's some opportunities that are ahead of you in your story. Here's a place where instead of just saying, hey, we can put you in and, you know, not make an offensive caricature. How about we make a character who's truly representative, truly authentic, and brings joy to the people that you're trying to represent? Because I would rather see that. I'd rather see a character who brings some small element of reality to me, who I can recognize as being made for me, than just someone who looks like me.
Right, and that's how it should be.
Yeah, and because there's so much joy. I mean, you know, when you feel, I think that one of the things that we don't talk about enough in life is just like, we're trying to bring joy to our audience and to our players. At the end of the day, what we're making is something that is a toy, that's something that is fun, something that engages and excites. And so if I can create something, if anyone can create something where a person who doesn't get to see themselves represented in media not only gets to see themselves represented physically, but gets to go, oh, I can see that they know about my life. They know who I am. You know, the little details in the way that you make food, in the way that you do your hair, in the way that you relate to things. Those are the things that bring people joy. And that's where the representation lies. It's when you sit down and you go, oh, that's me up there. Write it around it so that it becomes true in the world of the game, right? You can say, oh, she likes.
So this is very key with her. She has an experience that she describes for herself. Okay. Preview a set thing for something else, right? The Womanized Conference is where she decided to, I'll say decided, as much as she pointed out when she made a character. A lot of this is projection. As I said, if it's a narrative-driven team, okay? Narrative-driven game versus an RPG. You create your own legend. You write your own story. If, let's say, I want to design a character in Fallout, my Fallout 4 character can be me. Doesn't have to be me. It could be a fantasy I created. Do I want that character to represent me? No one is taking that away from people. Okay? You leave that element open. A lot of these people don't get it. Narratives in games. The activism in games is what turns me off. A lot of these games, these people have worked for in the past. I've seen what they do. You ruin my gameplay, you do other stuff. Kim is very much the person who, in a game of 40K, would want to see herself represented as a model, right as it gets ripped apart by that giant Tyranid. That's very different. You don't think these people exist, but they do. She has another interview. As part of that Womanize, she tells the story of when she created something. It's very different because she created a black character. It's very different. But to her, the representation in the story matters. But to your average gamer, they don't care about it. That's why she's very passionate about it.
You doing this, therefore it's okay.
Yeah, yeah.
But then if you think, like, if you asked, a lot of women and a lot of marginalized folks, like, hey, does this feel comfortable to you? They would probably answer like, oh no, absolutely not. This feels really difficult, and I don't find it romantic. But I think that's where that disconnect is, where you go, oh, something's being shown to you that's supposed to connect with you, but it's clearly not written for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I definitely have those moments where I take a step back and I'm like, well, yeah, I'm definitely not the target audience for this.
Yep. And that's hard, because we should start looking at that in the same way that we look at a lot of different kinds of ludonarrative dissonance, right? When something that we see doesn't match up to what we're doing. I think there's a lot to be said about that, because if I experience that, not only is it just taking me out of it for a moment, because I'm going like, oh, I find this uncomfortable, but it's also, for example, you might be less sympathetic of your protagonist then, because he's doing something now that you don't like. And so for you, you're like, oh, I have to now participate in this action that I don't fundamentally agree with. So I feel disconnected from the game, from the character, and that means that I'm suddenly not aligned anymore, which is what we aim for as designers, right? To make the player feel aligned with what they're doing. Even when that thing is morally ambiguous.
I've definitely had a few missions where I'm like, yep, this is a terrible idea, but the game's going to make me do it.
Yeah. And I think, sometimes I as someone who works in both AAA and indie, I'm well aware of like all the constraints. There's sometimes when you have to go, look, we're just going to put a strong and convincing narrative wrapper around this thing that we can't really work around. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of work that we could do, just change those things from the beginning. And if we started including more people in that process, we probably never come to a point where we have to have this happen. We can probably figure out another solution.
So I'm going to use that opportunity to kind of segue into my question. And that's, when it comes to diversity in the writer's room, how is the video game industry currently doing?
I think I want to think that it's
Did it again. You know what? 5-minute gaps. So, in this part coming up, you're going to see her. This is the representation in the writer's room, at least from what they say. This is very early on, how she views it. But the part that you see when people play games is a prime example. Immersion clearly is important to these two. The younger woman and Kim. Immersion is important. But they can't bring to use the word immersion. Hence, I view my Fallout 4 character as a representation of me in the world. Okay? Not quite literally, if it is the word. Current playthrough of Fallout 4, I'm the raider boss. I'm just waddling around the world and realizing what's going on. Man, no idea. I mean, if it weren't for the grand narrative narrator, they wouldn't know I'm the raider boss. Certain people know, right? But that's a narration question. And if I had to play a game that is, and as my character, right? I have the stuff that motivates my character. There's missions or sub stuff I have to do in a game that, if it's a game that's questionable or moral, you don't have to relate to it. You can find it. It's a little icky. But also, that's very telling. The not for you argument. That's interesting. The not for you argument shouldn't take out. I mean, hell, if I had every game that ever had an escort mission, a stealth mission, or something like that, I don't have the patience for that. I mean, to be fair, sometimes I get bored. I want to go in loud. But these are the people who wouldn't play Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. That's why probably the Bloodlines 2 is going to be sanitized. It's not done by Sweet Baby. That's done by Paradox. I mean, that game's been plagued with stuff. They're not for you. What's so cringy in missions? I mean, do you really have to make that many questionable moral choices in a game? I mean, like, if you play an action RPG, let's play, say, Fallout 4, let's say Bloodlines. I think even anyone cringes. So, like the original Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, you have to shut down a smut studio or let the people live. That's your moral gray choice, and that's set in the world of darkness. That's what the setting of Vampire is. So, what you're about to see, though, is her say about representation or how she should see it in the writing room. There's usually more about this online in other interviews, if you find it on it. It's very telling on her as well. So, but to conclude on the part, she wants to see herself represented. It's just, I'm not saying that's weird. Depends on kind of storytelling, if I really care. But does it ruin my opinion? No. I mean, to be fair, it's pretty abnormal for me. I mean, don't get really involved in a game like that. I mean, it just depends.
Improving. I I hope that, I think this year especially, we've seen a lot of promises about that. I think there's been a lot of social movements, a lot of awareness, a lot of talk about how we do have to do better. It is our responsibility as a society and as an industry within that to be more inclusive, to be more diverse. And so I hope that we're on the right track.
This was also during the summer of love. And George Floyd. So, talking about something that aged like fine wine or curd milk.
This year, while working actually on Suicide Squad, Kill the Justice League with Rocksteady, was the first time that I was in a writer's room with another Black writer. And I've been in the industry for 7 years.
Right there. 4 years that game was in development. So probably 3.5. Now, in reality, you say a game takes 2 to 3 years. Okay? It takes 2 to 3 years. She always also references she was working on Miles Morales and probably Spider-Man too. So, bear in mind that if you read between the language and the stuff. Boy, this is a beginning that tells the tale of Suicide Squad. This was roughly an outline. I mean, bear in mind, it's not like old. But the first time she's ever worked with another colored person or minority in a room. So, coded languages everywhere.
And he's been in the industry for about 15. And I don't, like, that for me is wild, is like, it's hard to believe that can still be true, to say like, that's it. So I think that's where I currently stand, where I'm like, I want to see more of it. I am starting to see it improve, but I think there's still a ways to go, especially in leadership. I see a lot of, I think, junior writers that we're bringing in, a lot of, first time writers, a lot of really super talented people who are bringing in from a bunch of different backgrounds. But a lot of the time they're entering into systems where they haven't promoted a lot of people of color. They haven't promoted a lot of marginalized identities. They haven't promoted a lot of, LGBTQ folks. They haven't promoted a lot of, and basically anyone who looks like them. So they get into the industry, but all of say the lead or director positions are still held by the same people. And that's, I think, where we have to start really working, is realizing, who has been working here for a long time, who's already here, who can become leaders and provide a space. Because it's one thing, I think.
So leadership is the problem, according to her, at this period of time, which is the reverse of almost now. Okay? You have entire studios, meritocracy kind of thing, versus we are hiring for representation. You do not know why. No one knows why studios make the hiring they do. Game development takes years to do. 2 to 3 years. It takes 2 to 3 years to do development. But why is this your most important? According to her, marginalized representation is the first and foremost for her. Not how you're working on the project. You can blame corporate culture all you want. All corporate culture cares about, ultimately, is are they making money? But look at Forspoken. Look at the games they've worked on. And someone go, hey, we're doing Spider-Man 2. Sweet baby did. Well, what was the fall off of Spider-Man? Dramatic. Dad of War has had a whole bunch of backlash. So, it's something to think about.
If you say, hey, I'm going to be a male lead and I'm going to create an all-female team of writers, like, cool. But if they come up with a bunch of ideas that speak for them,
this is nice whataboutism.
And you still hold all of the power to say, no, I disagree, I'm going to go ahead and do this, then are you really helping? It's about also saying, hey, there's space for you in leadership, there's space for you in management, there's space for you to move up the ranks. So I think we need to do better with that. And that's where I'd like to see a little more focus. But yeah, I would say that we're improving the industry in that way.
It's really illustrative what you said, that you've been working on in the industry for 7 years, and that was like the first time that there was another person of color in the same room. Or
I've had another Black person for myself, but I think that a lot of folks of color have had that same experience. For the most part, it's very rare still.
Yeah, it's kind of staggering to think about.
Yeah, but it explains a lot. I think,
yeah, no,
the treatment of all
really
these characters.
I guess kind of related to that is there an issue with retaining writers from sort of like marginalized groups? Like, is it, and if so, is it kind of an issue of they're kind of thrown into these environments where it's difficult to succeed, or is it just kind of the strict limitations, it seems like, on being able to really just advance your career?
It's all the above, I think. I think one, we have a lot of, as I was saying, we have a lot of folks who are coming in new, right? Who are juniors, who are enthusiastic, who want to join it and who deserve a place. But they come in and they end up getting very little support, very little understanding of what it is to be marginalized, very little understanding of how that's going to affect them, how people are going to treat them, and also, very little understanding of how their background is going to inform their work. And I think, unfortunately, that burns a lot of newcomers out.
And what burns a lot of new people out in terms of writing? Bad companies working on games. You can work your entire, let's say, work 6 months on a project. Whether they're young, they don't have to be of color either. It's an industry that chews people out, spits them out in coding. You never know if your project's going to be used, done, where your bills are coming from, unless you're with a AAA studio. Hell, most of the people who live in Los Angeles were washed up actresses and writers. They're all like, they're going to get work, but doesn't mean you're talented. Sometimes you would get told your work sucks. You stink. You're bad at your job. I've heard stories of people inside, right? They want to develop games, but then eventually they may not be cut out for it. I mean, doesn't mean you're good. Doesn't mean you're qualified. See entire teams put together one game and they never get work again. Don't ever hear about them. Sometimes they go somewhere. I mean, we're not even talking about the QA people.
And makes it so that they're stuck in these situations where they're still working under the status quo. And so, the room, let's say the writer's room has maybe diversified, but are they being treated well? Are they being cared for? Does that matter to the management? A lot of the time the answer is no. And similarly, I think the amount of work that women and marginalized identities have to do in this industry means that they often do have to do all that extra work. Because when we talk about something like sensitivity reading, and the reason that I still like it and still do it is that I think it's important. But often that work is being handled by marginalized people on these game teams. So before they're willing to pay for someone to come in and do this work for money, they'll often ask, let's say you have an Asian writer on your team, and you have one person who's representative, and you're writing a game, let's say about like an Asian culture. So every time that you have a question about it, you go, oh, I'll just ask her. So you keep going back to her every time. And at the end of the week, you've spent 4 hours of her time, and now she's a little bit behind on the script that she's supposed to deliver because she lost that time. So then, she goes to the manager, and the manager says, well, why are you falling behind? And because they don't value that work, because they think, oh, I'm just asking her a question about her culture. That's going to be easy for her. They don't value it as work. And so, now all of a sudden she's overwhelmed because she's doing that. And that happens so often that becomes free labor for people to do that. I think it means that, the marginalized people on your team are going to do additional labor, be it emotional.
Doesn't mean you're going to pass it off to minorities.
Oh, no, I've definitely heard quite a few stories, not for game development necessarily, but even in like animation, I feel like that's definitely an issue that kind of crosses industries, really. So that's
Or it's funny. I wonder what whataboutisms, where these people get this as examples. I'm not saying this doesn't happen. I mean, to be fair, I usually find most people are insensitive or they don't give a absolute shit about a setting. I mean, if I looked at a setting and said, oh, that's problematic or that is offensive, right? Prime example. I mean, I've seen games, I'm just like, well, that's borderline offensive straight out of the bat. Straight out of the gate. Hell, does that offend me any? Probably not. Not because I'm a white person. Hell, I'm a gamer. Bro, sometimes I just look at a game. I judge a game based upon how they handle their setting. That's what I care about. I care about the setting. I care about that. If you make your setting the most insufferable, part of the thing is in the current era in gaming is I think these activists infiltrated deeper than what we give them credit. And what I feel about that, and it's rather disappointing, to be honest. It's like a corporate suit's going to understand when you're falling behind. Because at this time, depending on how delayed your project is, that's the only time the higher-ups really care. Most of the time, higher-ups aren't going to care about it. Mark my words on that one. They're not going to care. I mean, unless you're that far behind. All right? You're not going to bother it. And plus, most game development studios, teams are so damn tiny. Hell, good luck making the cut at all. If diversity and that is your main focus, by her standard, that would explain why a lot of games have issues. You put that before you put the actual coding and the bugs. That combined with the near elimination of QA departments in the last 4 years. You can look at a team and figure out some people want veterancy, you know. But I highly doubt the one in the whataboutisms that she brings up exist. You're not going to bother the one Indian person about the culture.
I think it's in everything, you know, it's every time you have to answer a question about your identity, it's taking time from you that is valuable. And right now, the way that I think about it, and the reason that I am happy a lot of the time to talk both about writing a narrative and also diversity is that I currently have the time. Like I and by time, I don't necessarily mean like hours of the day, because who has enough of those, but I have the energy. I have the capacity to do it because I would have wanted to have more people talking about it when I started it. And so there might come a day where I'm like, man, I am tired of talking about this. But for now, it's something that really, it gives me energy to talk about it and to relate to people and to hear folks' experience with the same thing, because it inspires me, I think, to work towards changing that.
It's good to keep in mind because the game industry already has a high turnover rate in general.
Yeah.
And I can't even imagine what it's like for marginalized people.
Oh, and that's exactly it. And I think with the pandemic and seeing the way that things are changing, we're kind of shining a light on a lot of that as we become, you know, now we can work remotely. So immediately you have a different set of people you can and should hire. But there is a feeling that, you know, why wasn't this happening before? And, you know, I also credit a lot of discussion with Black Lives Matter, because you saw that the way that went through the video game industry, right? Like we saw so many responses from studios to say, we're going to do better, we're going to do this and that. And
what did I say?
I want that
LM.
Conversation to continue,
Era.
but I think it's, you know, it has to be ongoing if we want that to actually bear fruit.
So it sounds like, it often sounds like studios will make a commitment to recruiting more talent from diverse pools, but it also
Yes.
sounds like really there needs to be more of a focus on how they're going to help their employees succeed. Like I don't know if there's any sort of like career development resources or mentorships available, but it sounds like that might be an area where the industry needs to step up.
I think that, yeah, I think it absolutely does. And I think that people and studios especially need to start thinking about, why do they want diversity? Like, we all should have it. It is a good thing. And I could sit, and I'm sure we could all sit and talk about why we want diversity for hours. But a lot of the time, I think people see diversity as a check mark you can just kind of tick off. You can go, okay, we have a diverse team, perfect, next. But the question...
That is the activism stance. She's a true believer who wants to see perfection in the cause, but not the causality and the consequences of the actions. Maybe she could do this when you had better teams and industry she worked on. Imagine if she worked on the Suicide Squad game for almost 3.5 years, just to see it blow up entirely. The game's nothing bigger now.
It becomes like, why do you want a diverse team?
Maybe you put too much in diversity into the game versus the actual gameplay loop. Maybe not say it's Arkham, but at this time they could have probably wanted it in the Arkhamverse.
Are you actually doing it because you want to hear different perspectives, because you think it's important and it's going to make your product, your company, and your experiences better? Or do you just think, well, now I've done it, it's politically correct? Because the value of diversity is in the ideas that we can bring from our experiences, is in the skills that we can bring, and the different ways that our lives inform our work. And if we start looking at that, yeah, it's about it informs everything that you do. So why not make that the focus? So if you have a diverse room, how are you behaving differently than you would if you had a completely homogenous room? And do you know what the value is? Do you realize what you're getting out of it?
And you were mentioning also about how people can progress in the company, not just that there's maybe some stagnation, that they get hired, but we've also heard this past summer about some things like it's about how you make people feel comfortable and safe in the company. Like we've heard some things about like the higher ups were inviting certain people to like strip clubs and bars, and like that
absolutely.
that already excludes like women or Muslims.
So this year in 2020 was the infamous year. You still had like the Ubisoft scandal. You had a bunch of other stuff. I don't want to say what Naughty Dog's lawsuit was still going through the pipeline. You had Blizzard, which was about this time too. All the stuff coming out. Oh, half game development. Maybe not the coding. Because a lot of art teams are majority female. There are female teams on animation sometimes even. Coding is still largely done by men. I'm not saying there's not women. But it's a very mixed field. This is the thing when it comes to that. You're talking about, oh, you're gonna have this. They're like good old boys clubs. She says it with disdain. Both of them do. I don't get it. Well, I mean, I get it, but that's a jaded experience.
Muslims who may not want to drink and stuff like that. So I'm sure there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on where only certain kinds of people who are open to those opportunities will get promoted.
Yeah, and that's exactly, I think, issue. Like you've hit the nail on the head there. I think that I would love to see more focus on promoting and on figuring out why these differences matter and how we can actually use them to our advantage and create a healthier and more inclusive space. Because this summer was absolutely buck wild in terms of the things that were finally revealed. But I think that what's most relevant to me about what we saw this summer was how many people weren't surprised. Like
that was a little
people were like, yeah, I know. I wasn't. I think that a lot of people like myself were surprised that it was happening. They're surprised that these names were finally being made public. But there were people that, myself and so many people like me already knew about and had tried to do something about and had tried to flag to people. And the way that these things work is eventually you just get tired. Eventually you can keep telling people, hey, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. And you get tired, you get exhausted, you get traumatized, all these different things happen, and just create a space where you're too broken to even keep pushing back. And that's exactly what we saw this summer.
Yeah, the summer I think was a eye opener.
That's a huge thing that contributes to retaining minorities and women in the writers' room.
Yeah,
That you get
are you being
tired of
heard?
fighting these same fights over and over again.
Yeah, and it burns people out so fast because why would you stay in this space where you're not going to get any respect?
So what they're complaining about is the cultural corporate norm. Okay, that they perceive as the good old boys club. All right, basically can run stuff in a studio. Now, not saying they're not wrong. This was a year about, I think, what, Activision, Blizzard, and all that came out. So, what makes you think that that's not a bigger deal? I mean, I think when stuff like this comes out and it's ultimately just settled, because some of these lawsuits weren't real either. I mean, and a majority is going to be settled out of court less to that, even if it was partly not true. I mean, I think back then, what's it, Fox News, you still had Bill O'Reilly there. Just the sheer idea was that the Rupert Murdoch trial was still going along. Settlement happened and led to reforming of Fox News. All sorts of stories and lies came out of that about what went on there. So, and even if stuff did happen, hypothetically, a lot of heads rolled because of it. That's the kind of industry shakeup I think these women were expecting. Because was a very interesting cross section. I mean, Ubisoft themselves are not known for being an innocent company. They had sexual harassment. Naughty Dog did. Blizzard did as well. Riot Games had theirs. Most of them are like good old boys clubs. What you hope for and what you think are different stories.
And especially, when you say something about it, they tell you like you're the problem. This person's perfectly nice to me, a man, let's say, and then why are you complaining about it? And so then when you have a meeting and you need to invite this predatory person, then all of a sudden you're like, well, if I invite the predatory person, nothing's going to happen to me. But if I invite the predatory person into the same room and I also invite this person who's been complaining about him, then there's going to be, it's going to be a whole thing. It's going to be drama. So I'll just not invite her.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden she's on the outside. She doesn't get to contribute and the system continues. And that's just kind of like one framework that I often think about because we don't have enough respect or enough kindness to the marginalized people and to the vulnerable people that we know. And so they are seen as less necessary as versus like a predator who often holds a position of power and you go, okay, well, I don't want to screw up the project, so I'm going to keep this person in charge. But these people who are complaining, well, I'm sure we can replace them, and then the team will be quieter. And this just happens across the entire industry,
So what she's talking about, it's not because people are women. Hypothetically, I don't think that's the case for the industry as a whole. Just a little back then. Corporate gaming culture existed long before crony capitalism is a thing. Now, not all meetings are conducted did at strip clubs. Might just be boys' clubs. It might be that. Maybe. But what's happened is a lot of these people, like Kim Millar and them, they went for the other end of the spectrum. They started hiring and duplicating this on their own. In their own hiring practices. Maybe they had some, like when she worked on Validate. Validate was done by only black writers. She didn't feel comfortable. And I mean, you can duplicate this and it works one of two ways. Kind of thing. So you have to understand, this is pretty revealing. Because she's saying, well, corporate, that type of stuff. It's rather insane, but this is actually her in her own words. I mean, if this culture was happening a lot and you could prove it, it's very wrong. But who are these predators, these people? Okay? They shouldn't have a platform to do jobs. They should be called out. But then again, 2020, you still had Me Too as a thing. You still had other stuff. You always have sleazeball and corporate power. But like, you don't want to name names. If they're that bad, they should be drummed out of the industry, regardless of talent.
You know, I see it a lot more. I have seen it in AAA in the past, but it happens in indie as well. It happens in all these spaces, and it happens outside of. It happens everywhere. This is a societal issue, but I think in video games, it's often especially visible.
Yeah, I think for some people who kind of ask why didn't people report it earlier, they don't really understand how much pressure there is to just not rock the boat or to not come after people in power. Like,
Oh, yeah.
I think it kind of went unnoticed a little bit, but if anyone paid attention to what happened at Lab Zero Games, the guy in charge who was accused of misconduct just fired everybody. Like, that was his response to it.
And that's it. That's perfect example of like what happens when people speak up. They are putting themselves at risk. It should be like, I would love to live in a world where that was putting the person who was being.
Hold on. Right? Can I say this? This is what they accuse this person of, alright? Lab Zero Games, prime example. You could, right? Mike Z. Prime example here. Why was this done? This is also, female staff accused him of doing all sorts of unspeakable crap, alright? Just to give you an idea. They accused a man who was autistic of a whole bunch of other crap. And I would say history is very interesting. They accused him of laying off an entire team. All right? Women were using a man who was autistic. And they lied on him, accused him of harassment. These said same women went on to renounce their work, to desexualize what they thought. You can go back and look at that. There's a story.
But instead, it puts, anyone who said, hey, this is a problem is now out of a job because they did that. And so that happens to them. And who knows? Maybe they go like, okay, cool. That's good. I don't care. I'm.
And she's saying is these accusations were real. Okay? They were accusations against the head of Game Zero Labs that weren't true. But it damaged his reputation, and then eventually he went on to do other things. Yet the women could not invent anything new, and they tried to milk the success. Because they tried to accuse him of sexual harassment. It wasn't true, and it was already a small team.
To find other things. But imagine now a bunch of other people who may have been victimized by other predators looking at this and going, oh no, if that can happen to them, it can happen to me. And so you have to be ready to put so much on the line just to speak up. And then a lot of the time when you do, nothing happens. I am I am not someone who necessarily stays quiet about a lot of these things. But for me, I got tired of being loud because no one was listening. In what experiences I have had, I've seen, I've been warned I find myself warned by people going like, hey, watch out for this person. Hey, this person has done this, like, be careful. And I can go, okay, well, I'm going to report this to somebody. And then nothing happens. And then all of a sudden I do that again, and then nothing happens. And then eventually you can pick,
Aaron.
And this hasn't, necessarily happened, or maybe it has, I don't know actually, but if I tell someone who I think I trust, hey, this person's a problem, there's a chance that person goes, okay, I'm going to tell them that you think that. And now all of a sudden your predator knows that you know, and knows that you're causing problems. And so they're going to work extra hard to target you. And so now you're just in this, you're embroiled in this, and you're doing it all while you're trying to do a 40-hour-a-week job. So of course, how can you manage all of that and also do your 40 weeks of work or your 40 hours of work? You probably can't. So you work overtime to do it better, or you miss out on a certain amount of stuff, and all of a sudden you're not as valuable as them. And everyone knows that you're the one who complains and you're not as fun as them. But I've seen so many people, especially women.
So you're saying, and this happens to anybody, corporate culture sweeps stuff underneath the rug. Yet she comes at it from a lot of these hashtag believe all women scenario. I mean, the guy was pretty much done with Skullgirl. And other people. During a live stream, he made critically insensitive jokes, which she later apologized. Yeah, they became the idea as a team became woke moralist. And they're blaming Mike Z over it. People were leaving, so he laid off his staff and he wanted to make another one. Probably not the best move. He was accused of all that. There were also some more creepier people there. So go figure.
Especially women of color, just get treated so.
Could be said for anyone. People call you Karens. It's a term for guys as well who complain about everything. But if it's not baseless, you need to have that. So.
Poorly, and eventually just say it's not worth it. This might be their dream. This might be the thing that they love to do, but is it worth the abuse and is it worth the gaslighting? The answer is no.
Yeah, I think as a fan, one of the reasons why I was really kind of hopeful after this, like during the summer, is I was really kind of heartened by how many people in the community stepped up to support victims, to, reach out, let them know, hey, we believe you, to kind of, demand some accountability. And I think like some of us are paying pretty close attention, especially to Ubisoft, on some of the statements they've been issuing on what they're doing to change and what they're doing to kind of address the situation. But because we are on the outside, because we don't really have a look at what changes have taken place,
As I said, this was during the time of the Ubisoft sexual harassment lawsuit, by the way. That was in reference to, strangely enough, let me see. I don't know if I'm... Maybe not Ubisoft. No, that was 2023. I want to say, what was that? 2020. There was a 2022, right? 2020. So, let me see something here. So, allegations of crude sexual remarks in public. The first of the accusations occurred as far back as 2020. Allegations of widespread sexual misconduct came to light in 2020. Dozens of complaints, harassment. And this was in 2020. June of 2020. That's what they were talking about. And Ubisoft had to quell it. 2023 was the bigger lawsuit. This was the allegations of sexual harassment. And they're here saying that it was handled good.
I wonder if you could give us any sort of tips on what sort of changes should we be looking for? What sort of signs of progress should we be looking for?
I would hope that you could start to see it or hear it from the people in those positions. Like, I would hope that you'd be able to talk to folks and see them, take actual steps. And when, let's say a corporation says, hey, this is what we're doing, I would like to see that echoed by actual employees. Because a lot of the time I find that, and I think this is something that actually precipitated the call out of the games industry, is that a lot of the times you'll see corporations putting information out there, and none of the employees really seconding that. And so I would love to be able to hear it from more people who can speak more candidly about it. I would like to hear people be able to say, yeah, here's what tangibly changed for me. I think also, in terms of the representation that we have, I would like to see more of it and more of it and something that's done more, I guess, authentically. I'd like to see more discussions of the content that we're creating that feels more, that feel more free. Because a lot of the time I think, and I'd say Ubisoft is notorious for this, is something says like, oh no, this isn't political. And
What's funny at the time of this is because Ubisoft is still run by near the same people. So in June of 2020 is when the allegations came to light. Now, this is the reference that this is in reference to, that they're talking about now. Ubisoft had to do a lot of CYA. Now, I would say ish. I mean, just gonna go back. Shit. Here we are. This is in reference to. A lot of stuff you see here is interesting. Here you are. Thing is, sure. Then they had other stuff. Like right here. Like Ubisoft was a lot smaller teams. And of course the response. Bunch of people is there. It's still like a family-owned company.
the game is absolutely taking a hard line on a specific political thing, and you're like, wait a second, how can that possibly work? How can you make a military game, for example, that isn't political? What is the military if not? I think there are two kinds for me. They tell you like you're the problem.
Make people feel comfortable and safe in the company, like.
Oh crap! I lost the spot. See, she got to that point about the military stuff.
Oh no, I've definitely heard quite a few stories. Not writers from sort of like marginalized groups. Like, is it, and if so, is it kind of an issue of they're kind of thrown into these environments where it's difficult?
Oh hell! I lost that spot.
And at the end of the week, you've spent 4 hours of her time and different perspectives because you think it's important and it's going to make your product, your company, and your experiences better? Or do you just think, well, now I've done it. It's politically correct.
Oh. Oh, great. Fucking loves this.
And do this work for money. They'll often ask, let's say you have an Asian writer on your team, and you have one person who's are changing. We're kind of shining a light on a lot of that.
So the idea that games are apolitical, right? Especially in Ubisoft. Now, games being apolitical is a weird question and a weird problem. So if the games are meant to be apolitical, again, highly charged language here. Just I can put it. It's incredibly highly charged. She's like, well, games are political or they're not political. Okay. Now, game has military, so go figure, right? It's political. There's some weird stuff, because I don't know if she outlines it just because, like in the military, just because they use it, because that means they have to approve it or sign off on it. Sometimes, because if it is especially U.S. representation. I mean, most of it's not because it's political, it's because it's that. I mean, some people in settings usually find it that way as well. You know? She'll complain about that. That's a coded language. I find where
as we become, now we can work remotely. So immediately you have a different set of people you can and should hire. But there is a feeling that, why wasn't this happening before? And, I also credit a lot of discussion with Black Lives Matter, because you saw that the way that went through the video game industry, right? Like we saw so many responses from studios to say, we're going to do better, we're going to do this and that. And I want that conversation to continue, but I think it has to be ongoing if we want that to actually bear fruit.
So it sounds like, it often sounds like studios will make a commitment to recruiting more talent from diverse pools, but it also sounds like really there needs to be more of a focus on how they're going to help their employees succeed. Like I don't know if there's any sort of like career development resources or mentorships available, but it sounds like that might be an area where the industry needs to step up.
I think it absolutely does. And I think that people and studios especially need to start thinking about, why do they want diversity? Like, we all should have it. It is a good thing. And I could sit, and I'm sure we could all sit and talk about why we want diversity for hours. But a lot of the time, I think people see diversity as a check mark you can just kind of tick off. You can go, okay, we have a diverse team, perfect, next. But the question becomes like, why do you want a diverse team?
That's actually a good point. Diversity to her, at least, is not a pure checkbox. Okay. If you treat diversity as just something to fulfill a requirement, I'm going to be honest with you. That's dangerous. It's not true to your methodology. She's at least a true believer in the cause. Faith, one could say. She's familiar with it. True faith, true believers. You shouldn't hire diversity for diversity's sake. If it happens, it happens. Sometimes you aren't going to get that field. Diversity quotas are kind of shit in the industry. This is what I don't talk about. Let's say I go to a fast food joint. I don't want to hire Mexicans or whatever. I want only white-only staff. Well, yeah, good luck filling out a store. Like, most of your low-wage employees are going to be Mexican or minorities. One of the places I used to go, and I still go. That's what happened. It just happens all their new employees are Mexican. What the absolute fuck? Imagine that. How much your pool you got hired? Can't tell me. First come, first serve, you want warm bodies. And it's a reflection of the times. But if you can procure and prorate your hiring, as game development studios can, then you shouldn't have that issue. But bear in mind, what is your talent pool and what's applying?
Are you actually doing it because you want to hear different perspectives, because you think it's important and it's going to make your product, your company, and your experiences better? Or do you just think, well, now I've done it, it's politically correct? Because the value of diversity...
Whose political correctness, though? politically correct, meaning you're going by the language as well. PC words. Politically correct is what we call wokeism. Minor form before it is now. Being politically correct was changing out the actual terms. They just do it more publicly now. It was a very form of word policing because you couldn't say words. And you could, let's say, have phased out communities entirely. But yes, it's been that way for years.
Is in the ideas that we can bring from our experiences, is in the skills that we can bring, and the different ways that our lives inform our work. And if we start looking at that, it's about it informs everything that you do. So why not make that the focus? So if you have a diverse room, how are you behaving differently than you would if you had a completely homogenous room? Or do you know what the value is? Do you realize what you're getting out of it?
And you were mentioning also about how people can progress in the company, not just that there's maybe some stagnation, that they get hired, but we've also heard this past summer about some things like it's about how you make people feel comfortable and safe in the company. Like we've heard some things about like the higher ups were inviting certain people to like strip club bars and like that.
Absolutely.
That already excludes like.
To reiterate that point right there, that was the articles I showed. Came out that like all game companies, they had boys clubs. Right? Women are like, so we're not getting invited to bars, things of that nature. Okay. That's not going to happen, but that's it's not always the case, right? Prime example. But in that case, there should be punishments.
Women or Muslims who may not want to drink and stuff like that. So I'm sure there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on where only certain kinds of people who are open to those opportunities will get promoted.
Yeah, and that's exactly, I think, issue. Like you've hit the nail on the head there. I think that I would love to see more focus on promoting and on figuring out why these differences matter and how we can actually use them to our advantage and create a healthier and more inclusive space. Because this summer was absolutely buck wild in terms of the things that were finally revealed. But I think that what's most relevant to me about what we saw this summer was how many people weren't surprised. Like
that was a little
people were like, yeah, I know, I wasn't. I think that a lot of people like myself were surprised that it was happening. They were surprised that these names were finally being made public. But there were people that, myself and so many people like me already knew about and had tried to do something about and had tried to flag to people. And the way that these things work is eventually you just get tired. Eventually you can keep telling people, hey, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. And you get tired, you get exhausted, you get traumatized, all these different things happen, and just create a space where you're too broken to even keep pushing back. And that's exactly what we saw this summer.
Yeah, the summer, I think, was an eye-opener.
That's a huge thing that contributes to retaining minorities and women in the writers' room.
Yeah, it's
that you get tired of fighting these same fights over and over again.
Yeah, and it burns people out so fast because why would you stay in this space where you're not going to get any respect? And especially, when you say something about it, they tell you like you're the problem. This person's perfectly nice to me, a man, let's say, and then Why are you complaining about it? And so then when you have a meeting and you need to invite this predatory person, then all of a sudden you're like, well, if I invite the predatory person, nothing's going to happen to me. But if I invite the predatory person into the same room and I also invite this person who's been complaining about him, then there's going to be, it's going to be a whole thing. It's going to be drama. So I'll just not invite her.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden she's on the outside. She doesn't get to contribute and the system continues. And that's just kind of like one framework that I often think about, because we don't have enough respect or enough kindness to the marginalized people and to the vulnerable people that we know. And so they are seen as less necessary as versus like a predator who often holds a position of power, and you go, okay, well, I don't want to screw up the project, so I'm going to keep this person in charge. But these people who are complaining, well, I'm sure we can replace them, and then the team will be quiet.
I got that far.
And this just happens across the entire industry,
Yeah, this is the replaying of the Skullgirls, because I lost my exact spot. But yeah, this is an interesting drama if you ever want to look into what happened with Skullgirls and Mike Z. They were false allegations.
I see it a lot more. I have seen it in AAA in the past, but it happens in indie as well. It happens in all these spaces, and it happens outside of it. It happens everywhere. This is a societal issue, but I think in video games, it's often especially visible.
Yeah, I think for some people who kind of ask why didn't people report it earlier, they don't really understand how much pressure there is to just not rock the boat or to not come after people in power. Like, I think it kind of went unnoticed a little bit, but if anyone paid attention to what happened at Lab Zero Games, the guy in charge who was accused of misconduct just fired everybody. Like, that was his response to it.
And that's it. That's perfect example of like what happens when people speak up. They are putting themselves at risk. It should be like, I would love to live in a world where that was putting the person who was being accused at risk, but instead it puts, anyone who said, hey, this is a problem is now out of a job because they did that. And so that happens to them. And who knows, maybe they go like, okay, cool, that's good. I don't care. I'm going to find other things. But imagine now a bunch of other people who may have been victimized by other predators looking at this and going, oh no, if that can happen to them, it can happen to me. And so you have to be ready to put so much on the line just to speak up. And then a lot of the time when you do, nothing happens. I am I am not someone who necessarily stays quiet about a lot of these things. But for me, I got tired of being loud because no one was listening. In what experiences I have had, I've seen, I've been warned I find myself warned by people going like, hey, watch out for this person. Hey, this person has done this, like, be careful. And I can go, okay, well, I'm going to report this to somebody. And then nothing happens. And then all of a sudden I do that again, and then nothing happens. And then eventually you can pick, and this hasn't, necessarily happened, or maybe.
Basically, she's describing being a whistleblower and nothing happening.
It has, I don't know actually, but if I tell someone who I think I trust, hey, this is this person's problem, there's a chance that person goes, okay, I'm going to tell them that you think that. And now, all of a sudden, your predator knows that you know and knows that you're causing problems. And so they're going to work extra hard to target you.
Basically, the problem child gets whittled out. But then again, if it's a legit complaint, they should be filed out. I mean, eventually HR can't make enough complaints. Take enough. So, do the math.
So now you're just in this, you're embroiled in this, and you're doing it all while you're trying to do a 40-hour-a-week job. So, of course, how can you manage all of that and also do your 40 weeks of work or your 40 hours of work? You probably can't. So you work
Oh, yeah.
overtime to do it better, or you miss out on a certain amount of stuff, and all of a sudden you're not as valuable as them. And everyone knows that you're the one who complains, and you're not as fun as them. But you know, I've seen so many people, especially women, especially women of color, just get treated so poorly, and eventually just say it's not worth it. This might be their dream. This might be the thing that they love to do, but is it worth the abuse, and is it worth the gaslighting? The answer is no.
Yeah, I think as a fan, one of the reasons why I was really kind of hopeful after this, like during the summer, is I was really kind of heartened by how many people in the community stepped up to support victims, to, you know, reach out, let them know, hey, we believe you, to kind of, you know, demand some accountability. And I think like some of us are paying pretty close attention, especially to Ubisoft, on some of the statements they've been issuing on what they're doing to change and what they're doing to kind of address the situation. But because we are on the outside, because we don't really have a look at what changes have taken place, I wonder if you could give us any sort of tips on what sort of changes should we be looking for? What sort of signs of progress should we be looking for?
Huh.
I would hope that you could start to see it or hear it from the people in those positions. Like, I would hope that you'd be able to talk to folks and see them, you know, take actual steps. And when, you know, let's say a corporation says, hey, this is what we're doing, I would like to see that echoed by actual employees, because a lot of the time I find that, you know, and I think this is something that actually precipitated the call out of the games industry, is that a lot of the times you'll see corporations putting information out there and none of the employees really seconding that. And so I would love to be able to hear it from more people who can speak more candidly about it. I would like to hear people be able to say, yeah, here's what tangibly changed for me. I think also, you know, in terms of the representation that we have, I would like to see more of it, and more of it, and something that's done more, I guess, authentically. I'd like to see more discussions of the content that we're creating that feels more, that feel more free. Because a lot of the time I think, you know, and I'd say Ubisoft is notorious for this, is something says like, oh no, this isn't political. And the game is absolutely taking a hard line on a specific political thing, and you're like, wait a second, how can that possibly work? How can you make a military game, for example, that isn't political? What is the military if not an expression of politics?
See, that's, by the way, that's a political point I'll have to get to. I meant to get back to there. What's interesting is one of the lead directors removed was the one working on creator of Beyond Good and Evil. He announced his huge record. Negatives. And he was over the head of Skull and Bones. Now, that is actually interesting. Andrian Escablade's Gambring. Stone Chin. Yeah, so this was like a big Me Too moment. Like, been a lot, and Yevs Gelamont had to eventually respond, because this was like saying the whole thing. But potentially, yeah. But now you're about to get into the political statement of what they believe the military is. Now, without saying what her actual is, because there's military in a video game, it's political. A lot of these arguments here at this point get crazy. mean, you can look, you gotta take a lot of these accusations and you actually have to look at them. Some are legit, some aren't. Just like as they say about the harassment and how you're handling it. A lot of people, if you were working with Ubisoft and you knew the names, did you know those names were harassers? Well, she labeled Mike Z as bad, like he was covering up his sexual harassment. No, he got accused that he just laid off people that he could. So, yeah.
And so for me, that's that's super irresponsible. But two, I would prefer to live in a world where there's a certain amount of accountability, and whether that's, public or just narrative accountability, I want to be able to say, yeah, here's what we made. Here's the responsibility that we take for the things that we've made, and we're happy to talk about it. Wow. And sometimes there are going to be tough questions that get asked. There are going to be people who look at a given game and go, hey, I think you've misrepresented this. I think this is incorrect. And I wish that we lived in a space where we could go, yeah, it's not where we'd like it to be, and we want to work harder on that in the future, or we screwed up, or even just like, well, here's why we did it that way, and here's what we think. But instead, I think you ended up with...
That's a weird statement. She goes from a problematic statement that games are apolitical to talking about the design of the game she wants to do. Or could they be problematic? Let's see if she circles back. With saying that there's a military or an agenda or a history with politics or a movement tied to it. Because I would love to see what her take on what is Assassin's Creed, Far Cry 5 would have been. He plays the son of a Latin dictator, basically.
This weird kind of gray zone where you're like, oh, well, obviously we don't like these things in real life, but in the game, blah, 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 and it just becomes nothing. So I think a sign of actual change would be the willingness on the part of teams, on the part of companies, on the part of individuals to speak very openly and very candidly about the choices that are being made, the reasons that we value or have abandoned, or abandoned representation. If you say, hey, I made a game that's not representative, I would rather someone say, well, that was a deliberate choice, rather than go like, oh, well, I'm not really political. I don't really get into because by doing that, by saying, hey, we're going to make a game that's, let's say, like every character is going to be white and it's going to take this form, that is a choice. And I wish that we would look at these things as choices instead of going like, oh, well, don't put politics into your game. Like, no, let's.
I love how she emphasizes race. She has to keep it saying people are white. I think this is odd. A lot of this language she uses is weird. You can go back and track this original interview down. So, take it as a grain of salt, right? Or my word for it. That's where this comes from. But yes, games can be apolitical. Helldivers can be depicted as satirical fascism or a dictatorship leading super Earth. It's fine, you killed bugs and robots. Call it what it is. Could be, but they're keeping all sorts of identities out of that game, whether it's Antifa, all that. Both sides are being kept out of it. I don't hear them getting praise. It's apolitical game development. Apolitical game development can be done. Helldivers is doing it. Fortunately, we'll see how long they last. My take on Helldivers, I do have a take. But that's eventually going to become a worse situation. Dev versus player mentality. I can already see it. it's going to creep in slowly but surely.
Have a discussion about the reasons that we make these things. We don't have to dissect them until they're boring, but at least like say, hey, yeah, I have a point of view.
It's always wild to me when people say Assassin's Creed is not political.
Wow.
Like
Yeah,
it's literally about
everything
this
is.
anarchist group who kill politicians. Like,
Yeah.
how is that
it
not
is-
political by
That's
its
it.
very definition?
Yeah, because what gives anybody at any point the right to decide that this is what's better for the people? That is politics. Politics is founded in its.
So her argument is government this is a person who's worked on Assassin's Creed, right? They worked on the game. I would not call assassins anarchists. Okay? If anything, Templars represent control. They're usually behind the powers that be. All right? So to speak. I know it's a little weird for people. Anarchists are, to say assassins, and this is a very weird take about assassins. They're not anarchical. They have an order. They usually believe in freedom. Sometimes I put more libertine. They're not anarchists, though. Sometimes. But they're not below killing people if they have to. Because Assassin's Creed is still roughly about assassins taking out Templar. Or Templars taking out assassins. You can actually thank eventually a little game called Assassin's Creed Rogue for breaking a cycle. It made it worse. But that franchise has a lot of issues.
In that kind of decision, and yeah, it's fully deciding who gets to rule, who gets to not rule, and I think it's wild to say anything.
And the games themselves, they reflect that mentality. They do, like, they always begin, of course, with this description that it's made by a multicultural team of various religions and all that. Like, that's already at the beginning of every game. But also in the games themselves, you find like letters and documents and database entries where they kind of reflect this idea. And it's just wild to me that the people can still claim that they're not political.
For sure. It's something that I think once we've hit a level of maturity, a level of maturity in the industry where we can talk about that, where we can say, yeah, here's a position that we hold on it.
When
I think we're going to be a lot further.
That issue.
Because to me, it's so foolish to just say like, oh, we don't do that. We just don't address politics. Like, you absolutely do.
There is a weird kind of level of secrecy in the industry that you don't really get as much in like the movie industry, for example.
I think it's, yeah, you're right. I have to assume it's because we are, I think the positioning of a lot of these products is very singular. We say, okay, this is the kind of thing we want to make. These are the kinds of games that sell, and these are the kinds that don't. And until the past little while, I think that there's a real oversaturation of games that were fully combat based, and that was kind of it. And that doesn't necessarily lay the foundations for something that's very inclusive or representative.
Yeah, it's still kind of seen as indie territory. To not have combat or have this, like, people look down on mobile games because it's seen as, somehow inferior because it's played by a lot of women. And it's like,
Yeah,
maybe we
exactly.
should actually be looking at the reasons why women gravitate maybe towards these kinds of games more.
Yeah, and
There was a game study. It's outdated at this day. When they say mobile games are played by women, what kind of mobile games? What kind of mobile games are played? Who are the audiences for said games? All right? This is key here. All right? Who are the audience? Clearly, a tactical shooter doesn't have a lot of women in its audience, right? Assassin's Creed could still have women play it. It's probably why you could play as like both, you know. You so chose. But that being said, they look down. No one really cares. I mean, all games have an audience. No one literally looks down on mobile. It's just a question of quality on mobile, especially 2020. You know, wasn't the greatest time in games. Sometimes you get 30 FPS games. Sometimes you could get 60. Really depends. Right. Ugh.
the answer is usually inclusion, right? It's usually like, oh, we're gravitating towards this
But a lot of women graduate towards simulators and match 3 games. There's a certain type of game, right, that they gravitate towards. That's a very common trait.
because it at least includes us, or it doesn't involve the same thing. Because I do find that, well, I'm not going to say like there are tons of shooting games that I love. I enjoy those games. I play them all the time, but I wonder, how many different ways can we express a character in a world? How many different things can we do? And where would we be if we had invested as much time in perfecting the feeling of that versus perfecting the feeling of a gun?
Yeah. And it's like in these kind of what people dub casual games, it's often also that you don't get that element that is prevalent in a lot of combat games, is the culture of shit talking.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And that's already like, that's a very toxic space for women.
Absolutely.
This argument. This argument. Wow. It's funny. When I went through this, I think this was here. COD lobbies. Toxic space for environment for women. It's a toxic place environment for men. Right? Huh. Oh, just because I've also seen guys stick their girlfriends on to the headsets to cause issues as well. Interesting turn of events, right? Because you're see her say women don't want to be in the VC arguments. All right? Yeah. It's funny that this is in here. That's an interesting point. Let's see. And when someone says they played first-person shooters, I'll believe it when I see it. Right? Especially, not that I don't doubt female players. I understand it. But this is just analysis. I mean, to be fair, it's also weird why if you ever see game development goes downhill.
Absent
they hear you.
in these more casual games. So is it any wonder that women gravitate towards that?
Women gravitate towards a certain aspect. Match 3. I mean, like Genshin is a prime example. Has a lot of both men and women. Destiny is pretty high, is 50-50. WoW is another. Final Fantasy 14. You know? That has a high population of men and women. Maybe 60-40. So go figure. So this argument's really interesting. What's funny, there's a study from like 2020, but it's very dated now. Like women play The Sims. It's not marketed towards men.
Add more.
And I think that's it, where some people look at that and they go like, oh, you know, women can't be good at this multiplayer game. And then you go, hey, if I spend any time in a multiplayer game and try to talk to someone, like earnestly, if I say, hey, I want to talk strategy with this person that we're doing, and if they hear that I sound to them like a woman, and they all of a sudden start changing the way that they behave around me, whether that's sometimes that's with insults, with requests, or with something more crude, or sometimes it's just, oh, I'm going to.
Well, welcome to Most Gaming, Kim. Most guys don't listen to other guys. So that's not a female narrative thing, isn't it? Huh. I mean, I listen to anyone with experience and I'll listen to it. Especially in Division. Hell, Division 2, I don't even correct half the players' times anymore. I let them play how they want to play. Some just complain it's too hard. So I sit there as cool as a cucumber. I mean, and to be fair, women in a tactical situation are 50-50. That's when they gravitate towards certain games. I think occasionally you find a girl that's like gaming rage to a degree. Division, every so often I mean, considering they're like 3% of the actual population in that game, they don't exist. It's all like Destiny. Destiny's a separate matter. Now, if you go to a League of Legends, that's entirely separate. But as far as tactical analysis in games, no one discounts your opinion unless you're a dumbass. I mean, by all means, I'm not the most always correct player, efficient, but I'm also blunt as hell when it comes to dealing with certain scenarios. And she goes, I wouldn't be listened to. How are you presenting yourself? What's your rank? A lot of the times it's on you, your build, your weapon, especially if it's a game that requires it. Maybe some in-depth knowledge maybe some depth of your position. Because I would love to know what games these are. I've met some entirely. I've met most guys that I wouldn't keep in a tactical situation like that. Quite honestly. They'd be out of my circle quicker than that. You know? Ponder that a second. Right? So that thing, yeah, most people don't listen to other people in games. Especially guys. Hell, they'll think they're right even if they lose the game. Hate to tell you that. Welcome to the world.
Treat you like you don't know about this game. Either way.
And it's an last thing I'll say, it's an experience game. But I've sit there and struggled through worse.
I'm not getting better anymore. I'm not able to, like, I'm not actually being supported as a teammate. I'm not being treated as an equal. So I'm going to, even if I'm really good at it, just get tired of that. Like, if I'm not great at it, then I might go, okay, well, I'm never going to learn because
that's burnout. Or form a team with people. Play with people. And don't matchmake with blueberries. That's a good solution. Just saying. I've played in many games that require people. I have ran into competent and incompetent in both sexes. And I've been on the top and the bottom. Just because the methodology works for me doesn't mean it's going to work for somebody else. My ways are as blunt as hell. Half the time I can only get away with stuff I do in Division in certain games is because I'm more armored than God has angels. Or I know how to cheese it.
I'm just being targeted in this way. Or if I'm really good at it, how fun is it going to be for me, even if I do enjoy the game, to be called names, to be spoken to this way, to get these messages.
Oh, cool. Suck it
and
up.
Then I leave it, and then everyone goes.
A discussion about the balance between.
No, we'll call it here. I am tired, but I can touch on this tomorrow. Oh, but yeah, 3.5. But if you watch this back and play through, and apologize, it's rather long and don't know, just. And if you're new here, leave a like and subscribe. Personally, I do it. I'm not usually as sloppy though. It's just oof. But a large majority of this is very interesting given the subject matter. And even I'm finding stuff. I mean, it's interesting. So, yeah, I'm going to go probably take a nap. And then I remember. But yes. Tomorrow, yes. 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. Now, I'm going to try to get through that Dragon's Dogma. I mean, I feel like that is a daunting game. But it could be a lot simpler, too. So, thank you for watching, and I will be tomorrow, 3 p.m. Would start it maybe a little later, but should be good. I have probably keep the same subject matter tomorrow. So, but all right, that people, I am out. But I stream about 4 days a week. 3 days a week, pretty consistent. So, all right. Thank you very much for people's time. Catch people tomorrow.